Hello again, my name's Allie, and today I'm going to be demoing the Wiggling Worms lesson in the More Picture Perfect Science Lessons book. For it, we're going to use two mentor texts. The first one's going to be Wiggling Worms at Work, and this is the nonfiction book. And then the other one is Diary of a Worm, which is more fiction. I have to say this is one of my favorite books. I've used it as a mentor text for a writing lesson that I did last year. And it's absolutely hilarious. It's hilarious for adults and kids, so I really am excited that this lesson uses this book. The lesson objectives in the book are ask a question about objects, organisms, and events in the environment, design and conduct simple experiments to answer questions, use data to construct reasonable explanations, understand that each plant or animal has different structures that serve different functions in growth, survival, and reproduction, and understand that organisms cause changes to their environments. Some of these changes are detrimental and some are beneficial. I related this to the first grade science standard, Standard 2 of Life Science. An organism is a living thing that has physical characteristics to help it survive. And the I can statement is, I can observe a worm to learn more about it and how it helps the earth. To engage students, we'd read Diary of the Worm, and throughout the text I'd stop and ask the students prompting questions, just to get them thinking more about worms. For example, on March 20th, I'd stop and ask, it says, never bother Daddy when he's eating the newspaper. I'd ask the kids if they think that worms really have teeth. Or another example, on March 29th, there shows the picture of the worm crawling underground and one of him above ground, and I'd ask the kids if they thought a worm could crawl above and below ground, or just one or the other. From there, I'd tell the students that they're going to become scientists and do research on worms. I'd pass out the My Worm journal, have them put their name on it, and then we're going to go ahead and skip the first page, and we're going to first start our Wonderings page. So I'd go through each one with the students, probably as a whole class, since this is first grade, and ask the kids, do worms make tunnels? And they'd either write yes or no. Do worms have teeth? And they'd predict yes or no. And then after all the predictions are made, they would go down and they would make their own wonderings. So they'd write two questions that they wonder about worms. The next stage is the Explore Explain stage, and it's the day that the students will actually do the worm observations. So a few days before this, you definitely want to put together a worm bin, so like a clear bin with black paper around it, with soil and worms in it, so that they could begin making tunnels. And then on the observation day, you take the lid off so that students could see the tunnels that the worms make as well as the paper. And then they could begin filling out their worm wonderings. So under do worms make tunnels, they'd write their prediction, which they did in the engage stage, and then they'd actually write yes or no off their observations. They'd do that for all their worm wonderings, and then they'd actually get to take the worms to their desk and observe them even closer, and they'd fill out the earthworm observation form, and they'd draw pictures, figure out the parts of the body, and then you definitely want to remind students that worms are living things, so they need to be treated humanely before beginning this activity. To further explore worms, students would perform a damp or dry experiment, and they'd put two worms in a box, one side with a damp paper towel and one side with a dry paper towel, and then they'd cover the box and wait 10 minutes. At the end of 10 minutes, they'd take the lid off and see whether the worms went to the damp side or the dry side and check it off on the damp or dry experiment page in their journal. For the explain stage, I'd have students participate, and I guess you could call it a word sorts. Before having them do this, I would go over each of these words and have a discussion about what they mean, and then we'd read the How Do Worms Help the Earth paragraph. And as we read, students would be putting these in where they think they go, and then after every student has put it in, we would read the Wiggling Worms at Work book, and as I'm reading, the students would actually be fixing their answers and putting the appropriate words in the right places. During the elaborate stage, I'd have a discussion with the students about everything they had learned and observed about worms so far, and then I'd tell the students that I'm not quite convinced about one thing. I'd tell them that on the last page of Diary of a Worm it says, but like Mom always says, the earth never forgets we're here. And I'll remind them about the How Do Worms Help the Earth page that we filled out, and ask them, but how do we really know if worms help the earth? I would then have them do an experiment that's in the back of Wiggling Worms at Work book, in which they'd plant two plants, one with just regular soil and then one with soil with castings from the worms added to it. And over a few days we'd watch the plants grow and make notes about which one grew bigger and better. To evaluate the students, I would give them the scenario that a golf course is being overrun by moles who are digging up their favorite food, worms, and it is the groundskeeper's idea to deal with the problem by getting rid of all the worms and spraying them with pesticide. So it would be the job of the kids to come up with a poster that would display that keeping the worms is actually a good idea. It's not only because they're fascinating creatures, but because it actually helped the golf course grow better.